Okay, let's dig into our first session proper. It's called Whose Industry Is It Anyway? And this is to lay out the theme that we're going to dig into in a little bit more depth. So I'm going to do a little bit, just a few minutes, and then I'm going to invite Steve and Mike up, who are going to take you through different perspectives on the same question. And that will get us going, I think, in fine style. My hypothesis is this. As I look back 20, 22 years, I see an industry at that time which had a fantastic amount wrong with it, which had the wrong alignment. And I think we all, most of us, all of us, recognize that. And over the last 20 years, aided by regulation, but also by market forces, that shattered, it fell apart. And one absolutely fundamental thing happened. And if we imagine three individuals on the stage, maybe, and one of them is the industry, as providers, one of them is the profession, that's advisors, and one is a client in the middle. The profession, which was, I think, a lot less of a profession at that time, stood next to the industry and distributed their products. We see it even in language that persisted today with MiFID II. We see professionals who represent their client referred to as distributors when in fact they're anything but. All that happened was that the profession, the person representing that profession, crossed the stage over to this side and stood next to the client. So they weren't standing next to the industry anymore. And in those few steps, from that side to that side, was everything. And as the industry broke apart, as with profits broke apart, as the hegemony of the life offices, which had been there for 150 years, started to fracture, as in 2000 companies like Transact, and then later on the other platforms and wraps through Co-Funds and Funds Network and Standard Life Wrap and Nucleus and Novia and all the guys that started coming through in the first decade of the 2000s started to come through, it broke the industry even more. And that was the most incredibly exciting time. I don't know if you found it was exciting, but I did. I don't get out much. I know the pandemic really affected my social life, not at all. It was roughly neutral, but it's fine. That was an incredible time, and that accelerated, I think, as pensions freedom drove a bus through the back books of the companies that we're talking about, and they then had to run to catch up to work out how they were going to deal with that. CP121, the RDR instruments, PS131, FG1216, all these regulatory instruments hastened the pace of change, but all of it was mainly about doing one thing, which was locating that individual next to the client. And in that, once again, was everything. So we reach a point then, I'm going to say 2 or 3 years ago, pre-pandemic, where the industry and the profession, I think, this is just my hypothesis, right? And the idea of today is it's okay to disagree, was the best it had ever been. I think consumer outcomes at that point were as good as they have ever been. And by consumer outcomes, I don't just mean the amount of money that's in a pot. I mean the journey as well, because the journey matters too. Journey risk is important, just as destination risk is important. And if that's true, then we need to look now at where we are, because in the last 2 or 3 years, I think we've started to see a regression, a shift back. We've started to see the big players in the industry say, this has been fun, and we've really, really enjoyed watching what's been going on. There have been these kind of cracks in the pavement, and things grow through the cracks. And those things are new and exciting and vibrant, and we love reading about them. I love writing about them. I love talking about them. And we dig into them, and some of us adopt them. There's a lot of early adopters in this room. Right? There's a lot of people particularly from the profession, right at the front edge of it. But there's a lot behind you as well. And so people start to adopt these tools, these ways of working, and that's exciting too. And it further fractures it, and on we go and on we go. But there are countervailing forces as well. And as we start to see the reintegration of the industry, we start to see guys with deep pockets, the big providers, buying some of those new exciting things. And that can work really well, or as somebody said to me yesterday, they can cuddle them to death. You get guys who built incredible fintech that was designed to do one thing astonishingly well and improve consumer outcome in one kind of slice like that, spending their life in risk and control meetings in big providers, which isn't what they were ever going to be good at, right? So what happens there? The integration and the consolidation of the advisor market has to be part of this as well. It's very tempting. It's very tempting to take the 8% or whatever it might be. But as we've found in some of the research we've done, not everybody wants to go that route. But if we look at the profession as a whole, it is dominated by a few very, very large providers. And that's okay, right? Big doesn't have to be bad, and vertical integration doesn't have to be anything to worry about if consumer outcomes, by which I mean the destination and the journey, are at the heart of what it is that we are trying to do. My concern, and what I want us to dig into today, is that that's too easy to forget. It's too easy to say, well, listen, it's really hard to make money off custody and administration. It's really hard to make money off advice at scale. Most scale advice players lose money. They make the money from the investment solutions that go in with it. And we're talking about some pretty obvious people here, right? So what are we building? And if we can create an industry which tools up the profession, whichever part of it you're in, with the tools that mean that you sort of can't help but do the right things, then the right things that you do as a profession will only improve what's going on from there. But I think we are at an inflection point, and I'm going to spend a lot of time digging into this with Dave later, where we have the ability to reintegrate. The industry wants to self-heal. New skin is growing over the jagged kind of tears that the last 20 years have put into the flesh of the sector, right? New skin will grow, but it doesn't have to be like it was. And what I wonder, and what I want to set out today, is who benefits? Who is all this for? Are we keeping the right people in mind? And it won't be any surprise that the people I want to see the industry keep in mind are that client, and if they're very, very lucky, the advisor standing next to them. And that's our topic for today. I will shut up now. I'm going to ask Steve Nelson, our Insight Director, to come on. Oh, sorry, as you come up, Steve, I'll talk about my 3 tests. Sorry, they're up there. When we were working out this theme, we thought, right, well, we should have something to measure this by. And we thought we could come up with 3 tests. And they're not the most instant and obvious things, but we think they work. And they are written up there. Consumers should have confidence that the industry is working for their benefit. Confidence can be misplaced, of course, but it's up to the sector to make sure it's not. There should be constructive dialogue between the main actors in the sector, and those main actors you can see up there are 3, and that's not happening right now. And Mike's going to talk about that a little bit as well. And each part of the chain that influences a consumer outcome has to be solid. It can't slip and slide. If you're in the profession and you're watching this, if you're watching at home, you need to know that the stuff that you're using is solid, well-developed, properly done, will be here tomorrow, because you're depending on it in a completely different way from how you may have done 15 years ago. So everything has to work. The sector has to work together, and consumers have to be able to see that that is happening in a way that makes them believe that it's worth interacting with us, because all of this goes away very, very fast if they don't. That is it from me. I'll hand over to Steve now, who'll take you through a little bit of research.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Wow, God, this is weird, isn't it? My goodness, there could easily be a procession of people get up on stage and say, wow, it's weird to be in 3 dimensions again. But listen, Mark's done all the thank yous. I don't want to just echo that, but a huge, huge thank you to everybody for coming out today. On a personal note, I know quite a lot of people in the room today, but we've been working from home for 2 years. I've got a 25-month-old wee girl who has not slept through the night once in her life. And I've had last night in a hotel and tonight in a hotel. And if you can imagine that end scene in Shawshank Redemption, where Andy Dufresne reaches freedom for the first time, that was me at the Southwark Travelodge last night. So there we go. I'm going to. So Mark has laid out his 3 premises, and absolutely great, and I wholeheartedly agree with them. But in PowerPoint form, they exist in 1 and 2 dimensions, and it's my job and Mike's job to start to kick the tires a little bit, to start to test them, and to start to look for pockets of evidence. And I'm going to do that as the voice of the advice profession. And I'm so thrilled. I'm forever doing interviews and surveys and this, that, and the next thing. I'm so thrilled that there's a huge amount of our advisor panel here today. I can't really make eye contact with anyone, but I saw a few of them coming in. We've got 1,200 members of the advice profession on that panel. And the research I'm going to talk to you today about is our big annual omnibus State of the Advisor Nation. It's our biggest exercise of the year. It went live a couple of weeks ago, and we had 445 firms take anything between half an hour to an hour of their time to take part, which is no small feat. So a huge thank you. And it's all done in conjunction with the Market Research Society and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to point to some of that research this morning, and I'm going to take Mark's 3 premises in turn, and I'm going to start to test them. So taking Mark's last one, a financially strong sector. So how can we start to look at that from the advice profession's perspective? So every year we ask, and we ask this round about late October, early November, what is your turnover outlook been year on year? Now, bear in mind that the last 2 waves of the study have been conducted in arguably the most challenging trading circumstances, operating circumstances, certainly in my time in the sector. And the pattern of the chart that you see on the screen just now, focus on the green bars first of all. That was 2020. We're right in the middle of that chart. Is pretty much level year on year, my turnover outlook. So we observed that roughly 60% of the sector in horrendous conditions where, I don't know about you, but half of us were wondering what was going to happen to our business and our livelihood. What we observed was real resilience of the profession. Moving on to last year, you can start to see the advice profession move to the far right of the chart. I can see there's 2 journalists in the second row, and if I look at the trades tomorrow and see Lancat Steve says the advice profession's moving to the far right, I won't be pleased. The far right of the chart. So what we observe there is like real strength and real resilience. So far, so good. And I want to look at financial health and resilience from another perspective. And I want to point back to one of my favorite ever interviews with a gentleman who I think is streaming today. So hello, Darren, if you're there, where we were talking about, I can't even remember what we were talking about, but it was one of those conversations that starts over here and ends away over there, and you end up going off in a different direction, where we were talking about technology. And I asked him one question, and he said, well, I want technology to be as joined up as possible. I'm sick of having 15 different logins. I want things to be straight through. I want things to talk to one another. And that's a perfectly reasonable perspective to have. Can't imagine anybody who would disagree with that. But the same conversation 10 minutes later, he said, well, I'll always default to choosing best of breed. I'll always compartmentalize and choose the absolute best solution on behalf of my clients. So this is a situation where you've got 2 competing perspectives, both with goodness at their heart, but they are creating complexity on top of complexity. Because how does this link to the topic? Well, what we observe in our research is that when you take even the main componentry, such as platform adoption, back office adoption, cash flow modeling, investment research, risk profiling, so the top 4 or 5, and of our 445 sample, there is virtually no commonality. There are no 2 firms, unless they are mandated by a wider organization. No 2 firms are the same. There's just no commonality. And if you take that one step further and you look at the optionality, so you take, let's imagine there's 25 platforms, there's probably a bit more, but if you take a primary choice, secondary choice, legacy choice, there's around 10 different back office adoptions, around about 4 or 5 main cash flow modelers, 4 or 5 main risk profilers, and you just work out the pure permutations of that. It comes to 3.5 million different permutations. Now, that's not happening out in the field right now. Of course it's not, because there's only 5,000 or 6,000 firms. But that's another way of saying that there is virtually no chance of 2 firms being the same. And that's a real challenge for the sector. So when you have a healthy sector, which is innovating, which is creating new things, which is doing all lots of whiz-bang new things, and progressive firms are adopting these things, what we end up with often is complexity on top of complexity. And I'm yet to meet one firm who is entirely satisfied with their technology back to front. I'm going to test the second premise, so a sector that works in the best interests of consumers. Now, via quant analysis, via advisor quant analysis, that's very hard to test. It's not like you can ask a question to say, do you act in the best interests? Oh, well, Steve, no, actually. I've had to think about it, and I'm going to answer no. So you have to, it's like, we used to joke about due diligence questions that ask platforms, are you committed to the UK market? Like, who's going to, well, actually, no. Like, what are you going to do with that information? So we're going to look at that from a slightly different perspective. And we ask firms to self-identify, what do you believe gives the best client outcomes of the disciplines that you offer? And you can see in the chart there that number 1 and number 2, by some considerable distance, is a holistic view of financial well-being and behavioural planning. Now, a lot of what we're covering today is how far the sector has come on in the past 20 years or so. And my hypothesis is that were you to repeat that chart 20 years ago, go in a time machine, and that is like easily the shittest deployment of a time machine in history. But if you were to go back and do that, that would be flipped on its head. I bet you that would be flipped on its head. And then another interesting quirk of the data, some of the things that I love doing behind the scenes is to look at what seems like an obvious conclusion and then have a little look for some dissonance or fracturing underneath that data. And now we got firms, we got individuals within firms to self-identify where they believe they fit on the scale from 1 to 10, where 1, so our firm is a traditionalist, tax optimization, investment selection, product suitability, all things that we might stand on stage and say are old-fashioned, all the way up to 10, where our firm is entirely behind behavioural financial planning, all the modern progressive stuff that we start to see in the sector. And you can see, so the LANGCAT orange distribution is really clear. The majority of people self-identify towards the right-hand side of the scale. But there's just that little bit of dissonance where we then get the same people to identify where they feel their firm sits. Obviously, if you're a one-man or a one-woman band, that's not going to be the case. But where people are part of a wider organisation, they are more often than not self-identifying as being more progressive than the wider organisation, which I think is really interesting. So yes, do I believe that the profession is working in the best interest of clients? Of course they are. But again, that subject of complexity built upon complexity, sometimes the picture just isn't quite as clear as you might think. And last of all, probably the most contentious or most volatile part of the study, does each actor within the sector have productive dialogue with each other? Quite simply, we asked people, what are your biggest day-to-day frustrations? If we were to repeat this study 2 or 3 years ago, it was regulation by a mile. That has since flipped to provider administration incompetence, which isn't a great reflection of where we are in 2022, where we have, you only need to look at social media, which I wouldn't advise you spend too much of your time doing, below-the-line trade comments. One of my favourite Twitter comments of the pandemic was an advisor, I forget what the lad's name was, but he said, do you know, excitement to me now in my life is phoning a product provider with 50% battery on my phone, which is it's quite a sad reflection. I hope he's getting out now and back to conferences, which is quite funny, really. And the other thing, Mark mentioned that in the seminar. Mark mentioned this on the seminar a couple of weeks ago. But another thing that's really winding me up. Now, I did math. I was not that great at maths at university, but I had a couple of years of maths at university. And I keep seeing people in the profession saying, I'm contacting providers and they're saying, we're experiencing higher than average call volumes. And then the next month, higher than average call volumes. And then the next month, higher than average call volumes. And I'm thinking, do you know something? At some point, that's not how averages work. That's the norm, and you need to do something about it. So can we demonstrate that there is some kind of divorce of dialogue between the advice profession and providers? Well, I think so, and I think there are many people in the room who would agree with that. Last bit for me for the time being, assessment of value reports. So this is just one of the many, many pockets of evidence we've seen in terms of how the advice profession views the regulator. And we can have a debate over what the intended audience for AOV reports were. And Mike's going to talk a little bit about this in a little minute. But you see there 2/3 of the profession saying what a collective waste of time AOV reports are. Now, you could argue, are they is the advice profession the intended audience? But just that perception, and there is a little bit of clickbait in there, admittedly, but yeah, it just considering the sheer volume of time and energy and work and money that went into that from good people, like good people trying to do good things, that's not a great stat, I don't think. Then a little funny to close off with, we asked the advice profession, well, let's flip that on its head, and do you think that AOV reports should be conducted for different parts of the sector? And you can see a pretty consistent split across platforms, life companies, the profession itself, and technology providers, and then the regulator at the end, which is just a wonderful bit of passive aggression in data form, which is what I love to see. So yeah, that's a very quick whistle through some headlines from our advisor research. I'll be on later on talking to Kate, who I can see. Kate, hi, where we're going to go through the consumer research, which was kindly sponsored by Schroders, where we're going to talk about that. But for the time being, I'm going to hand over to my good friend and colleague, Mr. Mike Barrett. I want to applaud Mike.
He's not done anything yet.
Ever in 6 years.
We live in hope.
There we go. Good morning. It's nice to be back to normal, isn't it? I'm the last of the LANGCATs this morning, which I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying makes me headline act amongst the three of my colleagues. I've also got the joy of doing a regulation session, which fortunately I'm deeply sad, and I actually quite enjoy reading all of this stuff. Those of you who are on streaming, I can start to kind of hear some of you pressing mute, walking away, getting a cup of tea. You in the room have to stay and sit in on all of this. So that's the downside of being back to normal. Right, as we said, regulation. I want to keep this theme of the three tests going and try and look at them from kind of the angle, the viewpoint, the eye that the regulator might have on the industry, on the sector. First thing to remind ourselves is that the FCA have more responsibilities than just regulating financial advisors. They have to regulate the entire population, and they do that from both a supervision point of view and also this competition remit that they've had for a few years as well. So developing the markets, making them more effective, making them more competitive, which in turn supposedly will benefit the end consumer. Regulation, I think, gets a bit of a bad press. For years, I've stood up in front of kind of advisor seminars in old job, in new job, and you kind of joke around, have you read the latest paper? I can remember the first time it hit me talking about RDR, this huge change with the big pause that we saw earlier on coming into the sector, and asking advisors then, how many of you have actually read the RDR papers? And it was about October before, how many of you were ready for RDR? And virtually no hands went up. And at the time, working for a product provider, that was pretty scary to see kind of just how unprepared our customers who we were trying to flog products through at the time were for all of that. But I think if you kind of flip that on its head, everyone in the room would agree that we need to have a regulator. The opposite is just bizarre, kind of full-on Wild West company, time, cows week every single week, all of those types of things. You just can't comprehend that. But the regulation, it should be a force for good. It should be good for the consumer, clearly. It's going to benefit for them. But I think one of the biggest things they're missing with advisors in particular is trying to articulate more the benefits of good regulation to the advice sector. And as we'll see in a minute, this friction that we can demonstrate exists between the advice sector and the regulator, yeah, more than just you will be compliant or we'll come and hit you. Actually, particularly some of this work we've done with firms in the last few years, looking at things like MiFID and PROD and all of that stuff, Firms who have fully embraced that and gone through that process, we can see have a more effective business at the end of that result. They're getting much more predictable outcomes. They're not wasting their time trying to serve customers who it's uneconomical to do so. Very clear definition of target customers, very clear definition of the services they want to offer, and they're running effective businesses around all of that as well. And I think that's where the regulator needs to do more, to start to really sell the sizzle, sell the benefits of just simply being compliant as well. So going to rattle through these three tests. Major on the middle one of these constructive dialogue. But first I want to just kind of look at financially strong sector. Steve's survey is pretty good. He gets, as he said, 1,200 responses to the survey. Really thank everyone who completes it. The FCA have the advantage of fining somebody out of the sector if they don't complete their survey. So the annual returns, the data returns which we see and which we get off their website, this is looking at revenue advisor numbers from the entire sector. So looking at it again from the view of the regulator, blue line at the top is looking at the number of advice firms within the sector. This is going back to 2016, pretty stable. There's inevitably turnover as people come and go, but advice firms, advisor numbers have been stable and have been for a number of years. There's some evolution if we took that kind of further in this direction to RDR, but RDR didn't destroy the advice sector in any way, shape or form. If you look at the green bars, this is total revenue. This is investment business, incidentally, investment revenue. And you can see 2016, 2017, the boost for pension freedoms gave the advice sector, the demand for advice increased, and advice firm businesses became really, really successful off the back of that. Little bit of a tip down in 2020, inevitably, but beneath these numbers, we know from the FCA data, in an advice firm on average, 74% of advice of firm revenue is ongoing fees. So that safety net was pretty useful, I think, two years ago, where we all had that kind of, oh shit moment, what's happening in the world. I know from the advisor conversations we all had around about then, most advisors were pretty scared as what was happening, and they naturally focused on their existing clients. And that was the right thing to do from the client's perspective, but it was a very, very sensible thing to do from a business perspective. Protect the source of your greatest revenue. But we've seen commission in yellow trickle down. But again, this is investment revenue, so this would just be legacy commission, bonds, that type of stuff, which is still sat there. And the fee, moving to a fee-based model as well. So if you look at this purely from an advice sector, I think this paints a picture from the FCA's point of view of a really, really healthy, successful, flourishing advice sector. They obviously have another lens, as I mentioned earlier, beyond the advice sector, and I think that's a big question, and we could probably do a whole day around advice gap. We know consistently from separate research which we do and papers we've written for the likes of Open Money and that type of thing, there's 8% of the population work with financial advisors, financial planners, consistently has been for a number of years. So that advice gap is very much there. And I think that's the regulator's problem. I don't think advisors, particularly advisors who have gone through that exercise of prod, target market, where is the demand for my services, how should I be delivering those services to clients, those advisors are serving those customers increasingly well. The regulator, Treasury, etc., need to start to think, I think, about the advice gap. But as I said, that's a topic for another day. Second test, consumer trust. Petronella's skiing, I think, so I'm fairly confident she's not going to see this image. When I was putting this together, I was thinking, I went into the presentation, I thought, I'm going to spend ages trying to get a funny slide of Steve. This was generally the first one I went into. Spent 5 seconds. Yep, thank you very much. That will do. That's what having a 24-month-old toddler does to you, ladies and gentlemen. Anyway, enough of Steve's abuse. Home games, which I know many of you have been on and enjoyed, maybe. Certainly watched anyway over the last couple of years. We had a session just before Christmas where the comment came out, we get the regulator that we deserve. And I think there was that picked up a couple of headlines and quite a bit of debate around the time. And I've been thinking about that ever since, really. So what my take around that is that the advice sector is increasingly trying to refer to itself as a profession rather than just an industry. A profession, I think, actually should welcome a challenging regulator. It needs to be realistic. It needs to have a healthy dialogue, which we'll see about in a moment. It needs to understand the challenges that the advice sector faces. I think it should champion the advice sector as well. But having a challenging regulator to push to get those best consumer outcomes, deep down, I don't think many financial advisors would agree with that. And I think the regulator's a bit confused about the advice sector. There's a real kind of polarisation. You can spend your time looking at loads and loads of horror stories about pension transfers, British Steel, etc., and I'm sure that's something that might be touched on the next section. Alternatively, you look at some of the more formal assessments work that's been happening with assessing suitability. The first round of that, back 5 or 6 years ago, resulted in a 3-page paper with some good and poor practice, and maybe you need to do your MiFID disclosure a little bit better, but the heart of the advice was fine. Assessing suitability 2, which if you're sad like me, sounded like an awesome follow-up, just didn't happen. There was a big data request went out. The FCA had all of that data, and when they were reprioritising as a result of COVID, that data told them that there wasn't an issue in the advice sector. There was nothing there screaming through that data which said, you need to go and have a look at suitability in the advice sector. So that project's ended. So yeah, DB transfers on one hand, but suitability on the other. As I said, I don't think they necessarily, pension transfers aside, have a problem with the advice sector. But this dialogue, we've mentioned this a couple of times, this dialogue, this relationship I think that the advice profession has with the regulator and vice versa needs a little bit of work. Again, within Steve's brilliant survey, we asked, if you could change one thing in the sector, what would you do? Open-ended question, put in whatever response you want. Out of about 450 responses, I reckon about half of them were on the FCA. Had one person here said they wanted to bomb the FCA, which I feel like I need to alert somebody about. Steve informs me, unfortunately, that, was it market?
It's got to remain anonymous.
It's got to remain anonymous. So, yeah, unfortunately on that one. Clearly this is joking, or at least I hope that person is joking. There was a lot of other stuff on there as well. I think I learned a few new swear words, which, considering who I work for, it was quite astonishing going through that survey. But loads of negative stuff around the FCA, replace the FCA, put me in charge. Loads of stuff about wanting the FCA to understand the advice sector a little bit more. So the more constructive one, hopefully you can see at the top there, making them change the way the FCA looks at the industry. We mentioned the assessment of value, 0% using them extensively. I've read an assessment of value report. Anyone else? Yeah, hey, 2 people. Friend. We'll have a chat at lunchtime. I'll come and see you, Nick. I mean, clearly, I think as Steve hinted, a lot of these AOV reports aren't aimed at the advice sector. They're aimed at fund managers, internal governance. Around about 50% of firms in our survey outsource their investment proposition to external investment managers, so there'll be an expectation there, I think, that those individuals will be looking at the AOV reports. But to completely dismiss this stuff, and in particular to completely dismiss this stuff with the imminent arrival of Consumer Duty, I think, yeah, there is some way to go. And Consumer Duty, we've got to 46 minutes into the day, into a presentation before we've mentioned those 2 words. I'm pretty sure there won't be many conferences you'll go to this year which won't mention the words Consumer Duty, and we'll probably get into it a little bit more rapidly. This is kind of an indication, I think, of where we said about the regulator, the sector gets the regulator that it deserves. So on one hand, from an advice sector here, I don't think there's a huge amount which is necessarily going to be enormously disruptive. It's not like RDR where I'm stood in front of an audience thinking, my God, if you don't change in the next 3 months, you're going to go out of business. There's a lot of stuff here which advice firms will be doing. There's a lot of stuff which will be really, really positive, and I'll explain exactly why in a second. But it's a big, big change. It's a reflection that the regulator wants to give itself some new weapons to go and hit people with. It's a reflection of a lot of the stuff which is out there in guidance and good practice at the moment being bumped up to rules and giving the ability to enforce those rules. In an environment, our contention is that in an environment with a lack of engagement between the advice profession and the regulator and vice versa, there needs to be a lot of work, I think, for both parties to understand exactly how this is going to be implemented. So briefly, just to rattle through all of these, we'll be doing loads more around all of this stuff, particularly come July when the final rules are published, and then leading up to, I think it's April on the current timetable when the rules actually get implemented. Looking from around about 11 o'clock, going around consumers equipped to make effective decisions, getting the information they need in the right time, in the right way. So this is all about communications, quality of communications. Basically on this one, you need to work with a quality communications agency that understands the financial services sector. If anyone knows of any of those, then give us a shout. But more seriously, this is moving away from an environment which we've seen, and we can see in a number of providers, not just in the advice sector, probably perhaps I've seen it a lot more in some of the D2C sector, where you are technically compliant. So here's a 48-page terms and conditions document. There's one, I think, used to send it out on CD-ROM. Here's a CD-ROM with a 48-page terms and conditions document, which is technically compliant, but not even saddos like me are going to read that type of document, let alone understand it. So the consumer duty will require you to evidence, and by you, it's provider, advisor, whoever you are, even if you don't have a direct relationship with the customer, it will require you to evidence that your customers are receiving that information that they need in a timely manner, and that they're engaging with it, and that they're understanding it. So potentially a very, very big change, I think, for certainly on the provider side. Products and services give fair value. So think back to the reassessment of value and the low engagement with that. Probably going to get similar requirements coming into all parties, again, providers, advisors, whoever you are, whatever the nature of your relationship as well. The advice sector, some of the current good and poor practice explicitly calls out the need to look at total cost of ownership there. So if looking at the relationship between the asset manager, the platform, your advice fee, and assessing is that value for money. Products and services are fit for purpose. So this effectively is prod, embedding all of that stuff around prod. Any kind of whispers you might have heard that prod was going to get backed out and moved away from, it's exactly the opposite. And the final one, I think, is kind of, again, thinking back to the survey and the response we get for kind of customer services and 30 minutes on hold and all the rest of it. In theory, Consumer Duty bans a lot of that activity or makes it clear that will be a clear breach of the rules. So you will need to be meeting what is defined as reasonable expectations. So if you think it is reasonable that your customers are going to be on the call for 30 minutes and then get told to fax something in or whatever it is the hell some of these companies do, go for it. But I'm not sure actually, and particularly bearing in mind that these will be enforceable rules, the senior managers regime coming around a lot of it as well. A lot of this stuff, should see a pretty violent shift in some of the quality of services that are being on offered. But this comes down to communication to me. It comes down to communication between the advice sector and the regulator. As I said at the beginning, nobody's saying we shouldn't have a regulator, and actually deep down everyone will probably agree that we need to have the opposite. We need a regulator, but they need to understand the advice sector, the advice profession a lot more than they do at the moment. That'll extend to things like good and poor practice examples, webinars, rather than focusing on the retail financial services as a whole, which they're doing at the moment. There needs to be specific guidance for the advice sector to understand exactly what Consumer Duty means. And I also think more broadly, the way the regulator communicates could just be improved generally. I mean, has anyone tried to use the FCA's register recently? I mean, my God, again, I kind of like to pretend I understand this stuff, but that's probably one of the worst websites I think I've ever seen in my life. It's completely inaccessible. Real people, I don't think, have any chance whatsoever of getting information. More broadly, who do they communicate when they're communicating to customers? There's people starting to kind of come into this space and doing really good jobs as the consumer face of financial services. But the way scammers communicate to their investors, or their victims rather, the way scammers communicate, the use of social media, putting stuff out really, really rapidly. The FCA just aren't in that league. They don't have the ability to communicate in a way which is actually going to protect consumers from the type of thing which they're wanting to do. They're way too reactive around all of this. So yeah, perhaps thinking not only about communicating more effectively to advisors, but having a consumer face to the FCA as well. And I think that's it for me.
You've got a triangle.
Oh, we've got a triangle.
Yeah.
A triangle. And that basically sums up what I've just talked about. So this relationship between the sector, the regulator, providers come into this as well. This is where we think the sector, the profession needs to keep talking, which is coincidentally what I'm not planning on doing from there.
Thank you, Mike. It's nice to wield the power to get Mike to stop talking if I kind of just edge on the stage gradually. So he doesn't have a chair, but he'd get applause, so, you know, swings and roundabouts. So I'm going to open it up to you guys now. So I'm going to kick off with my own question, actually, and then I'll kind of open it out to the floor and to you at home. If you do want to submit your question, you just use that Ask a Question button. So you covered a lot of ground there and did a bit of really good scene setting. I suppose one question that I'd like to level to start off with is around, and I suppose I'm guilty of it myself as well, is that all the friendly people here are all very kind of progressive, forward-thinking type firms, generally financial planning and behavioural led. So that's the people that we talk to. But I guess this is one for you, Steve. Is there a sense of, because we're talking to those people, our vision of the world and reality gets a bit skewed and we're kind of bubble within a bubble and actually not reflecting the reality of the wider world, profession, financial services sector?
Yeah, a little. I think it's, yeah, that's my answer. No.
Thanks.
He's worth the money, eh?
Yeah, really worth it. So, right, let's rewind. We definitely, so our audience and our panel and our responses to the quant and qual analysis that we do, so as a proper answer, definitely over-indexes in those firms, so small to medium firms who have control of their own destiny. So what we observe in a lot of our studies is the voice of, exactly as you said, is the voice of the progressive, planning-led, I guess, centre of the world, centre of the universe. So I guess there is that element of concern sometimes, like in the back of my head, to say, look, are we just representing the best part of the sector? And I guess my counterpoint to that is that there's still enough in the stuff that I do in particular that worries me, and particularly around complexity, particularly around technology. So as I said in my talk, or at least I hope I said in my talk, it's absolutely chock full of good people doing good things and trying to do the right things. But just imagine a future where things like client review packs and onboarding and letters of authority and all that kind of stuff just worked better and worked properly. Then some of the conversations around the advice cap. Could we unlock more capacity within the really good firms? Yeah. So I know that's a bit of a politician's answer.
There's a funny tension in it, right? Because one argument to it is that if we're talking mainly to the thousands of firms that are small and in charge of their own destiny, we're not representing the very, very big vertically integrated guys in our studies. And kind of challenge back to that is, well, that doesn't matter, because if you're that big, you're going to have a close and continuous relationship with the regulator. We're going to see a level of supervision there that is much more important. And also, do we want our stats skewed by 500 SJP advisors who all have to work a certain way? It would knock the data off itself. But I had a really interesting experience just this week, right? And I do the Wednesday update thing, and I did it from the bar on the train on the way down, before the whiskey, well, during. And a paraplanner who lots of you would know writes to me every so often and gives me a hard time for what I write. And he did it again. It's fine. And he said roughly this, like, this is all lovely, but you're just preaching to the choir and you're missing out the bad practice. And he had some examples of bad practice and stuff he'd seen. And I was thinking about it, and he's right? He is right. I'm terrified when I write stuff. I'm terrified about calling that stuff out, even though I know it goes on, because most of the people I speak to are really, really, really good. And they'll say, well, we don't do that. you toss our Polson. What are you doing writing about that? That's not representative. But of course, most people believe themselves to be representative, even though they're not. So I think there is a pool in the sector where the potential outcomes that we're talking about are not as good as they could be. And back to my little bit at the start, setting up, and kind of what I want us to dig into today a little bit, actually, because we're not coming with answers, right? We want to dig into the subject. I'm worried that as the industry reintegrates and as we move back to a world that we would have recognized in 2000, 2002, with very, very large firms dominating even more than the moment. And there's no commission anymore, but of course there are other forms of ensuring that revenues are bulked up in the way that you need to bulk them up. The outcomes are maintained at the kind of optimal level. And I'm worried that we're not getting there. So I think probably as a company, not that we matter, right? We're just a little company, but we need to probably be better at calling that stuff out. But I hope the planners in the room will forgive that we talk about that stuff without necessarily painting you all with exactly the same stuff.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. So, questions from the floor. You'll need to wave at me and then I can direct a mic to you. Just down here, Rich. Thank you. If you can just wait for the mic to come to you, otherwise the people at home can't hear the question.
So my name's Guy Opperman. I'll ask a question, which is, so you talk
Premium
very
questions.
legitimately about a better interrelationship between the three organisations and understandably criticise various regulators. The bit that I think I'd be interested to hear is, so the single biggest disaster that government and regulators has had to deal with in the last few years is British Steel. And as an industry, how did that happen and why did that not get stopped? That I'd be really interested to hear your views on.
And you've got a minute to do that. Right?
I think a minute's enough, isn't it? Still. Mike, do you want to kick us off?
So I think in a minute there's a lot. One of the first things that jumps into mind is that I know several people, and I know several of them in this room, who admittedly with the benefit of hindsight were calling this stuff out probably even before it happened, and certainly were calling it out very loudly whilst it was happening. And that communication back from intermediaries, the advisors I'm referring to there, into the regulator, I think with the benefit of hindsight, most people would agree that didn't move rapidly enough. It's moving pretty rapidly now in terms of redress and working with the victims, the people who've gone through that process. But there was a lot of very, very experienced people who had no real skin in the game whatsoever from what we can see. And we're deeply cynical, and I think we would like to think we would sniff that stuff out if it was there. They were saying, this is a disaster waiting to happen. A couple of them are insufferably smug now, if you go and speak to them about exactly saying, I told you so. But that element of I told you so, I think from the advisors. I think that goes down to communication and an effective voice from the advice profession as a collective. So the trade bodies, whoever is, I'm not expecting one person in the room to be able to say and to necessarily to be able to initiate that change, but the trade bodies were missing in action, I think, in my view, for that stuff.
I'll add that there were bad actors across the piece there, Guy, I think. And specifically from the advice profession, there were some people who were doing really terrible things. There were providers who were enabling that. And that's, it's hard to criticise the advice profession from within the sector, because you get it back with, wings attached pretty fast. But when we look at the kinds of propositions, it's too much to do this second, but I think we will touch on it maybe during your session, maybe after. When we look at some of the reintegration of the propositions that people are trying to sell, we see skewed economics inside it. There are perverse incentives inside there. There are people feathering their own nest through complex investment schemes that are just not appropriate. Now, the bad actors who are putting those together are bad actors and need to be got rid of. And some of them are, but there will be more. The providers, I've got a bit of a thing for the providers here, because they enabled it and they liked the flow and they liked the money. And it wasn't until it went really, really horribly wrong that these guys were left saying, it wasn't me, Gov. I wasn't any part of it. This SIP scheme, I never wanted in that business. I didn't know. We didn't know. Look, over there, a badger. And is ridiculous. Now, you can regulate those guys fast. The small guys is very hard to do because they bop around the place. Those big guys, I think, exhibited fundamental moral failings apart from anything else. And I don't know what should happen to them, but I think they need to be dealt with. There is a problem here with supervision, I think, as well. Now, as Mike says, it moves super quick. These guys aren't holding their hand up and saying, by the way, I'm about to sell a double-geared something horrible inside a bond, inside a SIP in a company you've never heard of, where I'm an appointed rep of this guy who's over there, and then they're moving over there, and the financial promotions are done by a third company over here. And just undoing that is really, really difficult. So probably this is an argument for greater control and simplification of the chain that exists. I guess more generally, that exists between a client and the end goal, which is kind of the stock market, when we're coming out of DB in particular. But specifically around this, it feels to me that that alignment, you missed a bit at the start, but if the profession is properly aligned with its client, then the fact that the industry, by which I mean providers and fund managers and all the rest of it, can put together chains which are just give bad outcomes, which are suboptimal at best, then these guys can call that out. But the problem is these guys over here, who were not any part of a profession, I'd argue, right, for the planners in the room, they crossed the floor. And they should never have been able to do that. I don't know what the regulation answer is to that, because it has to be retrospective, because you can't necessarily catch it until it's done. But it seems to me there was a collective failing across the supply side and the demand side. And I know this is not a popular view probably, but I suspect that the regulator had a very, very tricky job to try and track down what was going on. And any time now, I believe, when we see complexity driving back in, that's when alarm bells go off. And when you look at what these guys were building for these poor buggers in the British Steel scheme, it was, well, none of us in this room, I suspect, would be happy to put a client anywhere near any of those propositions, let alone whether they should have come out of it in the first place. So collective failings. But that feels weak, right? That doesn't feel strong enough either, because. But it doesn't feel enough, because it sounds like nobody gets blamed if everybody gets blamed. But I think anybody allied with any provider that was part of that, and certainly anybody that was, God help you if you were advising people to do the wrong thing, you deserve everything you get. But the providers who thought, actually, do you know what? Our quarterly results are pumped full of DB money. Do you remember 17, 18? There was a massive, massive spike, new business levels going through the roof. That hitting some tables and some share prices and all that kind of stuff. And some British Steel gets wrapped in with that. Careful what you wish for. You can't just take the easy money and then ignore the bad stuff. I think the industry itself has to work a lot harder on that.